2 weeks after I buried my wife of 40 years, my phone rang. I stood in my kitchen watching my daughter pack away her mother's belongings, and I answered the call. It was Dr. Jonathan Meyer, Patricia's cardiologist. He did not say hello. His voice trembled as he told me he had just received the delayed toxicology report. He said Patricia's blood work did not add up. He found a synthetic compound in her system, one designed to mimic a fatal heart attack. Then he lowered his voice and told me something that froze the blood in my veins. He warned me not to tell my daughter or her husband anything. He said my life depended on it. What he showed me next changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The smell of cardboard and packing tape filled the house. I stood by the kitchen island, perfectly still, watching Stephanie wrap Patricia's antique china in thick layers of newspaper. Exactly 14 days had passed since we lowered my wife into the ground. The earth on her grave had not even settled yet. My 38-year-old daughter was already dismantling her life. Bradley, her husband, stood next to the dining table with a clipboard taking an inventory of the silver flatware. He held a silver fork up to the light, his eyes calculating its resale value. I watched them work with the ruthless efficiency of scavengers. Stephanie did not look at me. She kept her eyes focused on the plates, telling me in a soothing, practiced voice that they were simply decluttering. She claimed she wanted to save me the emotional pain of looking at her mother's things every day. She said living in a museum of memories would only deepen my grief. Her words sounded rehearsed, like a script she had practiced in the mirror. I said nothing. I just watched her wrap a gravy boat I had bought for Patricia on our 20th anniversary in Paris. Bradley chimed in, adjusting his designer glasses. He mentioned that the house was far too large for one person now. He suggested it was dangerous for a 69-year-old man to maintain a 2-story property alone. They were not packing memories. They were packing assets. I felt the cold weight of their greed settling into my chest. I had spent my entire life building this family. I worked 60 hours a week as a structural engineer to pay for Stephanie's private education. I handed her a degree completely debt-free. 10 years ago, when Bradley's first real estate venture collapsed under the weight of his own incompetence, I wrote a check that drained my savings to keep him out of bankruptcy court. I bailed him out, preserving their comfortable lifestyle. They never repaid a single cent. They never even offered. Instead, they began to view my wealth as their personal safety net. Now, with Patricia gone, they no longer saw a grieving father. They saw an obstacle. They treated me like a decaying asset, a landlord they were preparing to evict. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the sound of ripping tape. I remained quiet, absorbing their blatant disrespect, letting them believe their illusion of control was absolute. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. The sharp buzz broke the tension in the room. I pulled it out and saw the caller identification. It was Dr. Jonathan Meyer. I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. Dr. Meyer was a rigid, brilliant cardiologist who never called patients personally unless it was a matter of life and death. He always communicated through his receptionists. I turned my back to Stephanie and Bradley and pressed the phone to my ear. I offered a quiet greeting. Dr. Meyer did not return it. His voice was sharp, fast, and entirely devoid of his usual bedside manner. He asked if I was alone. I told him I was not home. He instructed me to step outside, but I knew walking away would instantly trigger Bradley's suspicion. I stayed exactly where I was, feigning a casual posture, and told the doctor to speak. Dr. Meyer took a deep breath. He explained that he had ordered a comprehensive toxicology panel after Patricia's sudden death. He had not been satisfied with the initial ruling of rapid heart failure. Patricia had been recovering well, and her heart was strong. The results had just arrived from the state laboratory. Dr. Meyer's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. He told me they found traces of a rare, untraceable digitalis derivative in her bloodstream. He explained that this was a synthetic compound specifically designed to induce cardiac arrest without leaving obvious markers. He said it required systematic daily administration over a period of weeks to build up to a lethal dose. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Someone had systematically poisoned my wife. Dr. Meyer did not stop there. He asked who had been preparing Patricia's meals during her final month. I closed my eyes. Stephanie and Bradley had moved in temporarily to help care for her. They had taken complete control of her diet and her medication schedule. They claimed they wanted me to rest. Dr. Meyer warned me not to confront them. He explicitly stated that if they were responsible for Patricia's death, I was undoubtedly their next target. He ordered me to leave the house immediately, use a secure connection, and come straight to his private clinic through the back entrance. He told me to trust no one, to eat nothing, and to drink nothing they offered me. The call ended abruptly. I stood in my kitchen holding a dead phone surrounded by the two people who had murdered the only woman I ever loved. The grief that had consumed me for 2 weeks instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. My daughter was a killer. I turned around slowly, sliding the phone back into my pocket. Stephanie had stopped packing. She was staring at me, her eyes narrowed with intense suspicion. The soothing fake daughter routine vanished instantly. She demanded to know who was on the phone. Her voice was sharp, invasive, and demanding. Bradley stopped counting the silver and stepped closer, his posture stiffening. They were a unified front, terrified that some external variable was about to ruin their careful plans. I knew I had to deploy a lie immediately, one that would completely blind them to the truth. I let out a long, heavy sigh, mimicking the exhaustion of an old, broken man. I looked at the floor and muttered that it was a representative from the life insurance company. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and nauseating. The tension drained from Stephanie's shoulders. A bright artificial smile spread across her face. Bradley actually took a step forward, his eyes lighting up with unfiltered greed. The word insurance acted like a spell, hypnotizing them with the promise of unearned wealth. Bradley immediately offered to handle the paperwork for me. He stepped into my personal space, his voice dripping with false concern. He said dealing with insurance agents was too stressful for me in my fragile state. He insisted that he could make the phone calls, manage the policies, and ensure the payout was expedited. He practically salivated at the thought of the money. Stephanie chimed in, agreeing with her husband, claiming they only wanted to protect my interests. Their sudden eagerness confirmed everything Dr. Meyer had just told me. They did not care about the loss of their mother. They only cared about the financial windfall her death represented. The poison made perfect sense now. They were desperate for cash, and Patricia's life insurance policy was their first target. They needed me out of the way to claim the rest of the estate. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and realized I was staring at a monster I had created through decades of unchecked generosity. I nodded slowly, playing the role of the defeated patriarch perfectly. I thanked Bradley for his offer and told him I would gather the documents later in the evening. They exchanged a quick, victorious glance. They thought they had won. They thought I was entirely oblivious. I needed to leave the house immediately, but I had to do it without raising any alarms. I rubbed my temples, squeezing my eyes shut, and feigned a sudden, severe headache. I told them the stress was getting to me, and I needed to pick up a fresh prescription of blood pressure medication from the pharmacy. Stephanie instantly offered to go for me. She reached for her car keys, insisting that I sit down and rest. She was terrified of letting me out of her sight. I knew I could not let her take control. I forced a stern note into my voice, projecting just enough of my old authority to make her pause. I told her I needed fresh air. I said sitting in the house surrounded by her mother's boxes was suffocating me. I grabbed my coat and my car keys before she could formulate another argument. I walked out the front door without waiting for her response. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. Bradley was watching me from the living room window, a dark silhouette against the sheer curtains. I merged onto the main road and the adrenaline finally hit me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The realization of my absolute vulnerability crashed over me. I had been eating the food they prepared. I had been drinking the coffee they poured. I had been swallowing the daily vitamins they handed me. I was trapped in a house with predators who smiled at me every morning while plotting my funeral. But I refused to panic. Panic is a useless emotion. I am an engineer. I build structures designed to withstand massive pressure. I understand how to locate stress points and reinforce weak foundations. My family thought they had found my weak point. They thought my grief made me blind. As I drove toward Dr. Meyer's clinic, my mind began to work with cold, mechanical precision. I would not confront them. I would not scream or demand answers. I would systematically dismantle their entire world. The pacing of my heart matched the speed of the car. I was no longer a victim waiting for the poison to take effect. I was the architect of their destruction, and the silent adjustment had just begun. I pulled into the empty parking space behind the medical building. My engine cut off, but the vibration seemed to stay in my hands. The drive had been a blur of gray asphalt and blinding realizations. I walked through the glass double doors of the clinic. The waiting room was usually packed with anxious retirees reading old magazines, but today it felt like a tomb. The receptionist was not at her desk. Her computer monitor was dark, and the overhead fluorescent lights had been switched off. Dr. Meyer had cleared the floor. I walked down the sterile white hallway, the sound of my own heavy footsteps echoing against the linoleum. The air smelled of rubbing alcohol and bleached cotton. It was the smell of sickness, the exact same smell that had clung to Patricia during her final weeks trapped in our upstairs bedroom. I reached the solid wooden door at the end of the corridor. The gold plaque read, Dr. Jonathan Meyer, Head of Cardiology. Before I could even raise my hand to knock, the door opened. Dr. Meyer stood there in the frame. He looked 10 years older than he had at the funeral just 2 weeks ago. He wore no white medical coat, just a wrinkled blue dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He did not offer his hand in greeting. He simply stepped back and motioned for me to enter his office. I stepped into the room. The blinds were drawn tightly shut, blocking out the afternoon sun entirely. The only light came from a small green glass lamp on his mahogany desk. As soon as I crossed the threshold, Dr. Meyer closed the heavy oak door behind me. I heard the distinct sharp click of the brass deadbolt sliding into place. That mechanical sound was a physical barrier permanently separating my past life from whatever nightmare I was about to enter. He pointed to a high-backed leather chair across from his desk. I sat down, keeping my posture rigidly straight. I am a structural engineer. I rely on strict posture, solid foundations, and unbroken columns to keep things from collapsing. If I let my shoulders slump, I felt my entire body might break apart into dust. Doctor. Meyer walked around his desk, but he did not sit in his own chair. He stood over the desk, opened a thick manila folder, and pulled out a single stack of paper stapled at the top left corner. He placed it squarely in the center of the leather blotting pad and slid it slowly across the smooth wood toward me. It was a laboratory report from the state medical examiner. The top page was completely covered in dense columns of numbers, complex chemical compounds, and microscopic analysis charts. It looked like a stress test report for a condemned skyscraper. I stared at the black ink, feeling the immense weight of the silence in the room pressing down on my chest. I looked up at Dr. Meyer. I told him I did not read medical Latin. I asked him to explain the numbers on that page as if he were explaining a collapsed bridge to a grieving city. I needed to know exactly where the steel had snapped. Dr. Meyer rested his knuckles on the desk and leaned his weight forward. He pointed to a highlighted row near the very bottom of the page. He pronounced a long, highly complex chemical name followed by the word derivative. He explained that this was a highly concentrated synthetic form of digitalis. He told me natural digitalis was derived from the foxglove plant, a common garden flower, but the specific substance found in Patricia's blood was a refined, weaponized laboratory-grade version. In highly controlled microscopic doses, it is sometimes used to treat severe congestive heart failure. But Patricia did not have heart failure. Her heart had been perfectly healthy before her sudden decline. Dr. Meyer explained that when this synthetic compound is introduced to a healthy cardiovascular system, in steadily escalating amounts, it forces the heart muscle to contract with violent, unnatural force. It actively disrupts the delicate electrical signals that tell the human heart when to beat and when to rest. Over time, it causes severe chronic nausea, paralyzing muscle weakness, terrifying blurred vision, and agonizing chest pressure. Finally, once the toxicity reaches a critical mass, it triggers a massive fatal arrhythmia. It literally beats a healthy heart to death from the inside out. I asked him how it was administered. My voice sounded hollow, like it belonged to another man standing in the dark corner of the office. Dr. Meyer shook his head, his eyes filled with a potent mixture of professional failure and deep, simmering anger. He said it was absolutely not a single massive dose. A single large dose would have caused violent immediate vomiting and a mandatory emergency room visit, where the rare toxin would have been easily identified by standard triage protocols. This poison was administered methodically, drop by agonizing drop, pill by pill, over a period of at least 90 days. He told me the synthetic compound is entirely tasteless, completely odorless, and highly soluble in any liquid. It could be easily mixed into a morning glass of orange juice, stirred into a warm bowl of chicken soup, or injected directly into a legitimate prescribed medication capsule using a standard diabetic syringe. The absolute cruelty of the method was staggering to comprehend. The killer had to sit right next to Patricia, watch her swallow the tainted food, and then hold her trembling hand while the terrifying symptoms ravaged her frail body. They had to watch her suffer every single day, meticulously adjusting the dosage to ensure her physical decline looked like a natural, tragic illness. The memories of the last 3 months violently flooded my mind, but they were no longer memories of a tragic illness. They were vivid memories of a slow, calculated execution. I remembered Patricia complaining that her morning tea tasted strangely chalky. I remembered Stephanie rushing across the room to take the porcelain cup away, scolding her mother gently, claiming the expensive tea bags must have gone bad in the pantry. I remembered the sudden violent bouts of dizziness that eventually confined Patricia to her bed. Bradley had been so incredibly eager to install heavy blackout curtains in her room, claiming the afternoon light was hurting her sensitive eyes. They were not comforting my dying wife. They were actively managing the visible symptoms of their own poison. They had purposefully isolated her in that upstairs bedroom, cutting her off from her lifelong friends, aggressively screening her phone calls, and taking absolute control over every single ounce of food and water she consumed. They had turned our peaceful home into a private torture chamber. Dr. Meyer explained exactly why the initial local autopsy missed the poison. He said synthetic digitalis perfectly mimics the exact physiological pathology of a natural catastrophic heart attack. Without a very specific documented reason to look for a rare synthetic cardiotoxin, a standard post-mortem examination would automatically register the death as natural causes. He told me he only ordered the highly advanced toxicology screening because something about Patricia's final electrocardiogram had bothered him deeply in the middle of the night. He said the electrical pattern of her final heartbeats looked mechanically manufactured, not organically failing. I stared at the state laboratory paper again. The dense numbers were no longer abstract data points. They were a detailed, undeniable blueprint of my wife's murder. I felt a cold, metallic rage spreading rapidly through my chest, replacing the warm blood in my veins with something heavy and unforgiving. I did not cry. Crying was for tragic accidents. Crying was for unavoidable natural disasters. This was premeditated financial slaughter. I looked up at the doctor. I thanked him for his relentless diligence. I asked him what the exact lethal dosage threshold was. I asked him how long it took for the poison to fully clear a human system. I asked these specific questions not out of morbid curiosity, but because I desperately needed to understand the exact weapon my enemies were actively using. I needed to know the precise mathematical parameters of the battlefield. Dr. Meyer looked at me, his professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine concern. He seemed unnerved by my sudden absolute calm. He did not understand that a seasoned structural engineer never panics when he finds a fatal structural flaw in a massive building. He quietly calculates the exact amount of necessary explosives required to bring the rest of the corrupted structure to the ground safely. Patricia had been my entire foundation. They had destroyed her for money. Now I was going to systematically tear down their entire world brick by arrogant brick. I sat across from Dr. Meyer, the air in the room heavy with the undeniable proof of my wife's murder. I expected the doctor to advise me on how to contact the authorities to discuss police reports and criminal investigations. Instead, his gaze hardened. The sorrow in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, clinical urgency. He leaned across the mahogany desk, his voice dropping to a low, demanding register. He asked me exactly what medications I was currently taking. I blinked, momentarily confused by the sudden change in subject. I told him I took a standard beta blocker for mild hypertension, a daily joint supplement, and an over-the-counter multivitamin. It was a standard regimen for a 69-year-old man, prescribed years ago and easily managed. He did not write this down. He did not nod. He stared directly into my eyes and asked who managed my prescriptions. I felt a sudden icy chill crawl up the back of my neck. I told him I used to manage them myself. I had always been meticulous about my health. But ever since Patricia's health began to decline rapidly 3 months ago, Stephanie had forcefully taken over all the household chores. She claimed she wanted to reduce my mental load so I could focus entirely on her mother. She went to the pharmacy. She brought the brown paper bags home. She painstakingly sorted the capsules into a plastic 7-day pill organizer every Sunday evening while sitting at the kitchen island. She made it a point to hand me my morning dose with a fresh glass of water before she left for the day, kissing me on the cheek and telling me to stay healthy for her. She had manufactured an image of the perfect, devoted daughter. Dr. Meyer extended his open palm across the desk. He did not ask a question. He issued a command. He told me to give him the pill organizer right now. My hands felt strangely numb as I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat. I pulled out the rectangular plastic container. It was bright blue with the days of the week printed in bold white letters across the snap-shut lids. It looked so ordinary, so perfectly mundane. It was the universal symbol of responsible aging, a cheap plastic tool meant to preserve life and maintain order. I placed it in the center of the doctor's desk right next to the state toxicology report that detailed my wife's brutal execution. Dr. Meyer did not touch it immediately. He looked at it as if I had just placed a live explosive device on his leather blotting pad. Then he turned around, pulled a pair of blue latex gloves from a wall-mounted dispenser, and snapped them tightly over his wrists. The sound of the rubber snapping against his skin was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He picked up the plastic container with extreme caution. He popped open the lid marked Tuesday. Today. I had already taken the morning dose just hours before arriving at his office. He examined the empty compartment, his jaw tightening, then moved his thumb to the evening section. He tipped the container upside down, letting the 3 evening pills roll gently onto a sterile white gauze pad he had placed on the desk. There was the chalky white multivitamin, the smooth yellow joint supplement, and the blue and clear capsule that contained my daily blood pressure medication. Dr. Meyer picked up a pair of surgical tweezers from a stainless steel tray. He isolated the blue and clear capsule, lifting it up to the harsh direct light of his desk lamp. He rotated it slowly, examining the seam where the 2 halves of the gelatin shell met. He asked me if I had ever noticed anything strange about the capsules lately. Any sticky residue or slight deformities. I shook my head, my throat suddenly entirely dry. I told him I simply swallowed what my daughter handed me without a second glance. I trusted her blindly. He set the capsule back on the gauze and reached into his drawer for a small, sharp surgical scalpel. With absolute practiced precision, Dr. Meyer used the very tip of the scalpel blade to separate the two halves of the gelatin capsule. He did not spill a single grain. The capsule was designed by the manufacturer to hold tiny, perfectly spherical white beads of extended-release medication. Dr. Meyer used the flat edge of the silver blade to spread the beads out across the bright white gauze. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal to my untrained eye. But the doctor leaned in much closer, bringing his articulated desk lamp down until the hot bulb was mere inches from the powder. He pulled open his top drawer, handed me a small magnifying glass, and told me to look closely at the center of the pile. I leaned forward, my breath catching painfully in my throat. Mixed in among the perfectly round, smooth white beads of the legitimate medication was a fine crystalline powder. It was almost imperceptible, a dull, slightly off-white, chalky dust clinging desperately to the pharmaceutical beads. It absolutely did not belong there. Dr. Meyer's voice was grim and heavy as he confirmed my absolute worst fear. He said standard extended-release beta blockers do not contain loose crystalline powder under any circumstances. He explained the terrifying mechanics of what I was looking at. Someone had manually opened the capsule, carefully added a precisely measured dose of the synthetic digitalis derivative, and seamlessly sealed it back up. They were doing this meticulously for every single day of the week, hiding a lethal weapon inside my life-saving medicine. I stared at the deadly dust scattered on the gauze. Dr. Meyer explained exactly what this specific twisted combination would do to my body. The beta blocker was designed to aggressively lower my heart rate and reduce my blood pressure. The hidden digitalis was designed to force my heart muscle to contract with violent, erratic, and unnatural strength. The combination was a manufactured cardiovascular nightmare. It was specifically designed to create a catastrophic, undetectable conflict within my chest, masking the poison's deadly effects as a massive, sudden, hypertensive crisis. It would look exactly like a grieving elderly widower suffering a fatal stress-induced heart attack, just weeks after burying his beloved wife. It was a flawless, legally impenetrable medical alibi. The walls of the quiet office seemed to shrink violently around me. The air grew instantly thin, making it difficult to pull oxygen into my lungs. I was no longer just a grieving husband uncovering a past tragedy. I was an active target in a present, ongoing, and highly calculated assassination. My own flesh and blood. The daughter I had raised and protected was systematically feeding me a lethal toxin every single day. Every morning she smiled brightly, asked how I slept, and handed me a cup of cold water laced with my own impending death. Every evening her husband Bradley patted my shoulder affectionately, told me to take it easy, and watched me swallow the very same substance that had brutally stopped his mother-in-law's heart. The sheer, unadulterated magnitude of their betrayal defied all human comprehension. They were not just greedy and entitled. They were methodical, patient, and completely devoid of basic human empathy. I thought about the quiet breakfast we had shared just hours ago. I remembered Stephanie sliding a plate of scrambled eggs toward me across the kitchen island, gently reminding me not to forget my morning pills. I had swallowed them without a single second thought, thanking her sincerely for her care. I had thanked my own executioner. I felt a sudden violent wave of profound nausea followed instantly by a massive surge of white-hot, electrifying adrenaline. The heavy, paralyzing grief that had anchored me to the floor for the past 14 days burned away completely in an instant. I looked at the deadly crystalline powder scattered across the white medical gauze. I looked at the thick state toxicology report detailing Patricia's agonizing final days. They had deliberately used my unconditional trust as a weapon against me. They had weaponized my advancing age, my profound grief, and my love for my family to blind me to their true intentions. But sitting in that chair, staring at the physical proof of their murderous greed, I realized they had made one massive fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was a weak, easily manipulated old man. They assumed my love made me entirely dependent on their mercy. They forgot who I was. They forgot that I had spent 40 demanding years calculating complex load bearings, reinforcing structurally weak foundations, and designing massive systems built to withstand devastating, catastrophic impacts. They thought they were quietly and effortlessly demolishing an abandoned, condemned building. They did not realize they had just triggered a massive, highly controlled demolition that was going to bury them both alive. I stood up slowly from the leather chair, planting my feet firmly on the floor. I did not shake. I did not tremble. My voice was completely steady and entirely devoid of fear when I spoke. I looked the doctor directly in the eyes and asked him to put the tampered capsule and the poisonous dust into a sealed evidence bag. The time for sorrow had officially ended. The time for the silent adjustment had begun. Dr. Meyer reached across his desk and picked up the heavy black receiver of his office telephone. His fingers hovered over the numbered keypad. He looked at me with absolute certainty and declared that he was calling the police immediately. He stated that attempted murder was a matter for homicide detectives and that I needed immediate police protection. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his. I pressed the receiver back down into its cradle. The loud click echoed sharply in me in complete disbelief. He argued that me in complete disbelief. He argued that my own daughter and her husband were actively trying to kill me. He pointed to the deadly powder sitting in the plastic evidence bag between us. He said I was entirely out of my mind to even consider returning to that house. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. I explained that I was not out of my mind. For the first time since my wife passed away, I was seeing everything with absolute clarity. I told the doctor to think carefully about the immediate consequences of involving law enforcement right now. I laid out the legal reality step by step. If a police cruiser pulled into my driveway this afternoon, Stephanie and Bradley would instantly know their plot had been discovered. The police would question them. They would feign absolute shock and profound horror. They would hire expensive defense attorneys using the money they had already stolen from me over the years. The legal system is incredibly slow and constantly burdened by the presumption of innocence. Search warrants take days to secure. Interrogations require carefully orchestrated procedures. In the meantime, my daughter and her husband would likely be out on bail entirely free to execute their desperate backup plan. I explained that their ultimate goal was never simply my death. My death was just the necessary mechanism to unlock my financial assets. They wanted the house. They wanted my retirement funds. They wanted the $2.5 million I had spent 40 demanding years building for my family. I leaned forward, making sure Dr. Meyer understood the absolute gravity of the financial threat. I told him that if Bradley felt the net closing in, he would not hesitate for a single second. He would immediately liquidate every single asset he could access. I knew they were already scheming to gain legal control over my estate. If they panicked, they would forge documents, empty my bank accounts, and transfer the funds to untraceable offshore accounts before the police could even petition a judge to freeze my assets. They would flee the country, leaving me completely bankrupt and leaving Patricia without any real justice. I told the doctor that I absolutely refused to let my wife's murderers live out their days on a tropical beach funded by my life savings. I refused to let the criminal justice system dictate the terms of my retribution. I demanded absolute control over their destruction. I am an engineer. When a massive structure is fundamentally corrupted, you do not just throw an explosive at it and hope for the best. You calculate the exact load bearing pillars. You place the charges meticulously in the dark. You bring the entire building down safely into its own footprint, ensuring the surrounding area remains entirely untouched. Stephanie and Bradley were the corrupted structure. I was going to demolish them from the inside out. Dr. Meyer listened to my cold logic in absolute silence. The ethical struggle was clearly visible on his tired face. He was a man sworn to preserve life and report harm. He argued that sending me back into that house was a direct violation of his medical oath. He warned me that one single mistake, one moment of carelessness, could result in a fatal dose. I acknowledged his concern, but stood my ground firmly. I told him my life was already forfeit the moment they decided to poison Patricia. The man I used to be died the moment they brought those moving boxes into my home. The only thing that mattered now was total, undeniable victory. I needed them to feel completely safe. I needed them to believe their meticulous plan was working perfectly. I needed them to become incredibly arrogant. Arrogance creates massive blind spots, and blind spots are exactly where traps are successfully sprung. I told him I needed time to secure my finances, lock down my estate, and build a legal cage they could never escape. To buy that precious time, I had to continue playing the role of the dying, clueless old man. I had to continue taking my daily medicine. I pointed to the evidence bag containing the poisoned capsule. I made my absolute demand. I told Dr. Meyer that I needed exact replicas of my medication. I needed harmless decoy pills that looked absolutely identical to the tampered capsules Stephanie prepared for me every Sunday. I needed the same blue and clear gelatin shells. I needed the same white extended release beads inside. I needed a complete safe supply that I could secretly swap out every single day right under their noses. I told him this was the only way to survive the coming weeks without triggering their suspicion. If I suddenly stopped taking the pills, they would notice my health improving. If I confronted them, they would run. The illusion had to be maintained flawlessly. Dr. Meyer rubbed his jaw, pacing slowly behind his heavy mahogany desk. He looked at the framed medical diplomas hanging on his wall, then looked back at me. He saw the immovable resolve in my eyes. He finally nodded slowly. He told me he could easily requisition empty capsules from the clinic pharmacy and fill them with a harmless inert powder that perfectly mimicked the texture and weight of the real medication. He agreed to supply me with enough decoy medication to last a full month. He walked over to his locked medical supply cabinet and began gathering the necessary materials. The pact was officially sealed. I was no longer just a grieving patient receiving terrible news. I was a man actively armed and walking willingly back into the lion's den. I parked my car in the driveway and turned off the engine. The house stood before me, 2 stories of red brick and white trim bathed in the fading afternoon light. It was the home where I had raised my family, the sanctuary where Patricia and I had shared 40 years of joy and quiet comfort. Now, looking through the windshield, the structure resembled a carefully constructed trap. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, taking slow and deeply measured breaths. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the small plastic vial Dr. Meyer had given me. I shook the harmless decoy capsules into my palm and kept my right hand closed tightly. I stepped out of the car and walked up the concrete path. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the heavy door open. The warm smell of roasted chicken filled the main hallway. Stephanie was in the kitchen humming a cheerful, upbeat tune as she prepared our dinner. Under any other circumstance, it would have been a comforting domestic scene. Today, it was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. Bradley was sitting in my favorite leather armchair in the living room. He stood up immediately when he heard the door close, walking toward me with that familiar expression of manufactured concern plastered perfectly across his face. He asked if I managed to pick up my new blood pressure prescription without any trouble. I nodded slowly, deliberately, slumping my shoulders to play the role of the exhausted, grieving old man. I told him the pharmacy line was incredibly long, and the fluorescent lights had made my headache return. Bradley smiled sympathetically, completely satisfied by my display of weakness. He turned to the entryway table and picked up a tall glass of ice water. In his other hand, he held a small plastic cup containing my evening pills. He held them out to me, his voice dripping with false warmth. He told me I needed to stay hydrated and take my medicine before we sat down to eat. He insisted it was highly important to keep my strength up. I looked down at the lethal dose resting in his steady hand. I reached out and took the plastic cup with my left hand and the glass of water with my right. I brought the cup to my lips, but I did not tilt the poison into my mouth. With a quick, practiced slide of my thumb, I slipped the tampered capsules into the cuff of my coat sleeve, while simultaneously dropping the inert decoy pills from my closed fist directly onto my tongue. I raised the glass and took a long, deliberate drink of cold water. I swallowed hard, making absolutely sure he watched my throat move. I lowered the glass and looked Bradley directly in the eyes. A cold, sharp power began radiating through my chest. He was eagerly waiting for my heart to fail, but he had just handed me the key to his own destruction. I handed the empty cup back to him and thanked him sincerely for taking such excellent care of me. I let a slow, appreciative smile spread across my face. Bradley smiled back, entirely oblivious to the fact that his flawless murder plot had just become the instrument of his absolute ruin. The following morning, I parked 3 blocks away from the address Dr. Meyer had given me. I walked through the financial district, checking my reflection in the glass storefronts to ensure I was not being followed. I entered a sleek, unmarked high-rise building and took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The polished brass doors opened into a cold, minimalist reception area. A secretary directed me to a corner office at the end of a long, soundproof hallway. I walked in and met Sarah Jenkins. Dr. Meyer had told me she was a ruthless estate lawyer, a former forensic accountant who dismantled corrupt corporate empires for a living. He had not exaggerated. Sarah did not offer me a cup of coffee. She did not express her condolences for the loss of my wife. She sat behind a massive glass desk, her eyes sharp and completely devoid of sentimentality. She instructed me to sit down and place my laptop, my physical bank tokens, and every piece of financial documentation I had managed to smuggle out of my house directly onto the glass. I emptied my leather briefcase. I handed over 40 years of my life. My pension files, my mutual fund portfolios, the deed to my house, and the comprehensive life insurance policy I had taken out on Patricia decades ago. Sarah pulled a thick yellow legal pad from her drawer and picked up a heavy silver pen. She asked me a single direct question. She wanted to know exactly how much money my daughter and her husband thought I had. I told her the estate was worth roughly $2.5 million, including the property and the liquid retirement accounts. Sarah nodded slowly. She opened my laptop, connected it to her secure network, and began typing with blistering speed. She told me we were going to conduct a total forensic sweep. She warned me that what we were about to find would likely destroy whatever lingering affection I still held for my child. I told her that affection had died the moment I saw the lethal powder on Dr. Meyer's desk. For the first hour, the room was entirely silent, except for the rapid clicking of her keyboard. Sarah pulled up my primary checking account, the one my pension deposited into every month. She cross-referenced the withdrawals against the physical bank statements I had brought. Suddenly, she stopped typing. She leaned closer to the monitor, her brow furrowing in deep concentration. She asked me if I had authorized a wire transfer of $50,000 on the 12th of October. I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. I told her I absolutely had not. The 12th of October was the week Patricia was first admitted to the hospital for severe dizziness. I had been sitting by her hospital bed for 6 days straight. Sarah turned the monitor toward me. She pointed a manicured finger at a line of digital text. The screen showed a direct wire transfer from my savings account to an entirely unfamiliar corporate entity registered in Delaware. I stared at the screen, my mind racing to process the theft. I asked her how they managed to bypass the dual authorization security protocol at my bank. Sarah did not look away from the numbers. She explained that they did not bypass it. They used my own credibility against me. She opened a secondary window displaying a digital copy of a document filed with my bank late last year. It was a preliminary financial proxy form. It granted Stephanie limited administrative access to my accounts to assist with medical billing. I remembered signing a stack of hospital admission papers in the waiting room while the doctors were examining Patricia. Stephanie had slipped that form into the middle of the pile, claiming it was just a standard hospital liability waiver. I had signed my name, blindly trusting my daughter while my wife was suffering. Sarah's voice was completely devoid of pity as she told me that single signature gave Stephanie the power to initiate internal transfers. Sarah pushed the investigation further. She told me that $50,000 was just a test run. It was a structural stress test to see if I would notice the missing funds. Because I was entirely focused on my dying wife, I never checked the balances. I never saw the cracks forming in the foundation of my own finances. Sarah began pulling up credit reports. She utilized her highly restricted legal database to run a comprehensive background check on both Stephanie and Bradley. The speed at which she worked was terrifying and deeply impressive. She was an absolute predator in her natural environment, and she had just caught the scent of blood. She opened a new file and asked me about Bradley's real estate business. I told her he built luxury condominiums, or at least he attempted to. I mentioned that I had bailed him out of a massive bankruptcy 10 years ago, but since then he claimed to be highly successful. He drove an expensive imported car and wore tailored suits. Sarah let out a short, humorless laugh. She clicked another button, and a cascade of red numbers filled the entire screen. She told me the tailored suits were paid for with phantom money. She explained that Bradley's current company was completely insolvent. He had taken out massive construction loans from 3 different private equity firms, promising them a guaranteed 20% return on a high-rise project that did not actually exist. He had used the second loan to pay the interest on the first loan, and the third loan to pay the interest on the second. I am an engineer. I recognized the structural mechanics immediately. It was a classic, unsustainable Ponzi scheme. The entire foundation was built on sand, and the tide was coming in fast. I asked her how bad the damage was. Sarah looked me dead in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. She said Bradley was currently in default for exactly $1.8 million. The private equity firms had already initiated hostile asset recovery protocols. But the debt did not stop there. Sarah switched her focus entirely to my daughter. She pulled up Stephanie's personal credit profile. The screen populated with endless rows of maxed-out credit cards, defaulted personal loans, and aggressive collection agency notices. Stephanie was carrying over $400,000 in unsecured consumer debt. She had been funding a lavish artificial lifestyle completely on credit, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of wealth, while her husband's business violently collapsed around them. The sheer scale of their financial ruin was staggering. They were not just greedy. They were drowning. They were desperately gasping for air, and my $2.5 million estate was the only life raft in sight. Sarah leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. She laid out the brutal reality of the situation. She told me that federal regulators were undoubtedly already circling Bradley's fraudulent company. When the Securities and Exchange Commission finally dropped the hammer, he would face decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. His only possible escape was immediate massive liquidity. He needed millions of dollars in untraceable cash to pay off the most aggressive creditors and flee the jurisdiction before the federal indictments were officially unsealed. The timeline suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. They had not planned to kill Patricia immediately. They had started poisoning her slowly, hoping she would pass away naturally, so they could claim her life insurance policy to float Bradley's loans for a few more months. But the pressure from the creditors must have escalated. They ran out of time. They needed the entire estate, and they needed it right now. That was why they had escalated their timeline. That was why Bradley was rushing to pack up my house. That was why my daily blood pressure pills were suddenly filled with lethal crystalline powder. I was standing directly between a desperate, cornered criminal and his only avenue of escape. Sarah did not give me time to process the betrayal. She slammed her hands down on the glass desk, breaking my train of thought. She told me we had a massive, immediate problem. She pulled up the most recent activity on my primary checking account. Just 3 hours ago, while I was sitting in Dr. Meyer's office discovering the truth about the poison, someone had attempted to initiate a wire transfer of $500,000. The transaction had been flagged and temporarily frozen by the bank's fraud department due to the unusually large amount. Sarah looked at me, her expression grim. She said the fraud alert would only hold for 24 hours. By tomorrow afternoon, the bank would release the funds directly into Bradley's failing corporate account. They were making their final move. They believed I would be dead by the end of the week, and they were already looting the vault. I felt the anger crystallize in my veins. It was no longer a hot, chaotic rage. It was cold, calculated, and entirely focused. I looked at the brilliant, ruthless lawyer sitting across from me. I asked her exactly what we needed to do to sever their access permanently and completely destroy their financial future. Sarah smiled for the first time since I walked into her office. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. She opened a fresh legal document on her computer and told me it was time to build a firewall they could never breach. She said we were going to make me a ghost. We were going to take every single dollar, every single asset, and every single piece of property and lock it away in an impenetrable fortress. We were going to let Bradley and Stephanie reach out with their greedy, murderous hands, only to find absolutely nothing but empty air. I sat up perfectly straight, resting my hands firmly on the glass desk. I told her to begin the demolition. Sarah did not stop with the initial bank statements. She opened a highly encrypted portal on her computer and accessed federal court dockets. She told me to look closely at the screen. She pulled up a sealed grand jury subpoena originating from the Southern District of New York. Bradley was not just a failing businessman. He was the primary target of an active, highly aggressive federal investigation. Sarah translated the dense legal jargon into brutal reality. 2 years ago, Bradley had broken ground on a luxury condominium project called Oakwood Heights. He had aggressively courted elderly investors, promising them guaranteed risk-free returns on their retirement savings. But he never poured a single ounce of concrete. He never secured the proper zoning permits. He took their money and used it to pay off the massive, crippling debts from his previous failed ventures. When those new investors started demanding their quarterly dividends, Bradley panicked. He sought out hard money lenders. These were not traditional banks. These were ruthless, unregulated private equity firms that charged extortionate interest rates and demanded absolute collateral. Sarah pointed to a specific lien filed against Bradley's personal company. The document showed he owed over $1.8 million, and the final balloon payment was due in exactly 3 weeks. If he defaulted, the lenders would seize everything, and the federal prosecutors would use the bankruptcy as the final piece of evidence to unseal the criminal indictment. Bradley was staring directly at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Sarah shifted her focus back to my daughter. She brought up the credit card statements she had intercepted. The numbers on the screen painted a grotesque portrait of pathological vanity. Stephanie was not simply struggling to buy groceries. She was actively burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars to maintain a flawless, wealthy facade. I saw charges for $30,000 first-class vacations to the Maldives. I saw invoices for custom designer wardrobes and weekly luxury spa treatments. I saw the lease payments for a $90,000 imported sports car. She had opened 6 different secret credit cards under a fictitious corporate entity to hide the debt from her own husband. She was currently carrying $400,000 in unsecured consumer debt, with interest rates soaring past 25%. Every single month she was drowning a little more desperately, trying to keep up appearances at the local country club, while her entire world secretly collapsed. The sheer scale of their combined financial devastation was absolute. They were standing at the very edge of a massive, unavoidable cliff. I sat in the leather chair, staring at the digital footprint of their utter moral bankruptcy. The mathematical equation of their survival became terrifyingly clear. Bradley needed nearly $2 million to satisfy the hard money lenders and keep the federal prosecutors at bay. Stephanie needed $500,000 just to clear her secret credit cards and avoid personal bankruptcy. Their combined debt was almost exactly $2.5 million. That was the exact estimated value of my entire estate. My house, my pension, and my life savings represented the exact dollar amount required to save them from total destruction. I was not a father to them. I was a human bank vault, and they had spent the last 3 months trying to crack the combination. The timeline of my wife's murder suddenly aligned perfectly with the dates on the federal subpoenas. Sarah showed me the exact day the Securities and Exchange Commission formally requested Bradley's corporate ledgers. It was the exact same week Patricia first started complaining about the strange, chalky taste in her morning tea. They had panicked. They realized the federal walls were closing in fast. They needed immediate liquidity. Their initial plan was likely to poison Patricia slowly, let her pass away from seemingly natural causes, and quietly collect her life insurance payout to float their debts for a few more months. They assumed her death would break me completely, leaving me entirely dependent on them and willing to hand over control of the finances. But the life insurance policy was not enough. The hard money lenders had accelerated their collection schedule. The pressure became unbearable. They ran out of time to play the long game. This desperate lack of time explained why my daily blood pressure medication was now filled with lethal crystalline powder. They could no longer wait for me to die of a broken heart. They needed the remaining $2 million immediately. They needed to force my signature on the forged power of attorney, legally declare me mentally incompetent, and then administer a massive fatal dose of the digitalis before the federal agents knocked on their door. They were racing against a ticking clock, and they were using my life as their currency. Sarah leaned back in her chair, letting the sheer horror of the revelation settle over the room. She told me that criminals cornered by federal agencies become incredibly unpredictable and highly dangerous. They completely lose their connection to reality. They convince themselves that one final desperate act of violence will magically erase all their past mistakes. Bradley and Stephanie had convinced themselves that murdering my wife and poisoning me was simply a necessary business transaction. I felt a cold, metallic calm wash over me. The anger was gone, replaced by a pure surgical focus. The emotional ties that had bound me to my daughter snapped, completely severed by the undeniable proof of her monstrous greed. I realized I was no longer dealing with family members. I was dealing with desperate, cornered predators who were actively hunting me. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was completely ignorant of their financial ruin. They assumed their fake smiles and feigned concern were successfully masking their desperation. They did not realize that I now possessed the exact blueprint of their destruction. I knew their exact debts. I knew their absolute deadlines. I knew exactly what they needed to survive. I looked at the federal court documents glowing on the computer screen. I did not feel fear. I felt the immense, terrifying power of absolute knowledge. I asked Sarah how long it would take to completely sever my financial existence from the physical world. I wanted to know the exact legal mechanics required to ensure that when Bradley finally reached for my money to save himself from prison, he would grasp absolutely nothing but dust. I wanted to build a financial fortress so impenetrable that even their most desperate, violent attempts to breach it would only accelerate their own demise. The motive had been completely revealed. The mathematical certainty of their treason was laid bare on the glass desk. They had chosen to play a game of life and death for $2.5 million. They had no idea they had just lost the game before it even truly began. Sarah Jenkins pulled a fresh stack of legal documents from her high-speed printer. The thick paper was heavy, intricately watermarked, and completely unforgiving. She laid the pages methodically across the glass desk and handed me her heavy silver fountain pen. She explained that we were not simply moving my money to another local bank or hiding it in a standard family account. We were legally annihilating my absolute ownership of every single dollar. She was creating a highly complex, irrevocable offshore trust. She looked me directly in the eyes and told me the word irrevocable was the single most powerful weapon in the English legal language. Once I signed these specific papers, I could never unilaterally undo the transfer. The newly formed trust would instantly become an entirely independent legal entity. It would be a financial fortress governed by strict international rules that not even a federal bankruptcy judge could easily pierce. I listened closely as she detailed the mechanics of my new reality. I would no longer be the legal owner of my hard-earned pension, my extensive mutual funds, or the massive life insurance payout I received after Patricia died. I would merely be a named beneficiary receiving a tightly controlled monthly stipend that the designated trustee would manage. If Bradley ever tried to physically force me to sign a personal check, the signature would be completely worthless. If Stephanie tried to aggressively activate her forged medical power of attorney at my local bank branch, the managers would simply laugh in her face. The money would simply not exist under my social security number anymore. I picked up the heavy silver pen. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I pressed the sharp tip to the heavy paper and signed my full legal name on the dotted line. With that single fluid stroke of dark blue ink, I completely vaporized $2 million from the American banking system. Sarah moved immediately to her computer terminal. She opened a highly secure, heavily encrypted banking portal and initiated the massive electronic wire transfers. We were sending the entire bulk of the liquid capital to a notoriously secure financial institution located in the Cayman Islands. She explained that offshore accounts are not just for wealthy tax evaders or corrupt politicians. They are the ultimate impenetrable firewall against domestic financial predators. Bradley's ruthless hard money lenders operated entirely within the jurisdiction of the United States. The federal prosecutors building his massive wire fraud indictment had legal authority strictly within American borders. By moving my life savings entirely offshore, we were placing my assets completely outside their legal reach. It would take a massive, incredibly expensive, multi-year international legal battle for anyone to even locate the hidden funds, let alone successfully petition a foreign government to seize them. I watched the glowing green numbers on her monitor drop rapidly from $2 million down to absolutely zero. The satisfaction washing over me was purely mechanical and deeply profound. I thought about the pending fraudulent wire transfer of $500,000 that Bradley had desperately tried to initiate earlier that same morning. Sarah looked at the bank screen and confirmed the devastating reality of his impending failure. She explained that when the bank fraud department finally lifted their temporary security hold tomorrow afternoon, the automated clearing system would aggressively try to pull the stolen funds. But the financial well was now completely dry. The massive transaction would violently fail due to entirely insufficient funds. The bank software would instantly trigger a massive internal red flag, permanently freezing Bradley's fraudulent corporate accounts and likely alerting the federal authorities to his desperate unauthorized access. His final stolen lifeline was officially severed. The liquid assets were successfully hidden, but the physical property still remained highly vulnerable. The sprawling colonial home where I had raised my daughter was worth nearly $500,000 entirely on its own. Bradley was currently standing in my dining room, casually packing my dead wife's expensive china, undoubtedly measuring the square footage in his mind to secure a massive home equity line of credit. Sarah slid a completely different set of legal documents across the glass desk. This document was a comprehensive warranty deed. She informed me that she had quietly registered a totally anonymous shell company in the state of Delaware just 15 minutes ago. The company had a generic, incredibly boring name specifically designed to blend seamlessly into millions of other corporate tax records. She instructed me to sign the warranty deed legally, selling my entire residential property to this newly formed corporate entity for the ridiculous sum of $1 single. I signed the heavy paper without a flinch. She notarized it immediately with her official steel crimping seal. She explained the brilliant trap she had just constructed. The offshore trust now completely owned the Delaware Shell Company. The Delaware Shell Company, in turn, completely owned the physical house. I retained a legally binding ironclad lifetime residency clause. This meant I could live comfortably in that house until my dying breath, but I possessed absolutely no borrowable equity. I could not legally sell the property. I could not take out a mortgage against it. And most importantly, neither could my murderous daughter or her desperate husband. My family home was no longer a profitable inheritance waiting to be claimed. It was a phantom piece of real estate, completely insulated from Bradley's crushing, catastrophic debt. Sarah gathered the signed legal documents and placed them carefully into a heavy fireproof safe located directly behind her desk. She pushed the heavy steel door shut and spun the combination dial. The loud mechanical click echoed sharply in the silent office. She turned back to me and delivered the final definitive assessment of our morning operation. She stated clearly that as of this exact moment, I was entirely destitute on paper. I had no savings accounts to drain. I had no checking accounts to loot. I owned no property to leverage. I possessed absolutely nothing of tangible value that a federal court could legally seize or a desperate son-in-law could violently steal. I was a financial ghost walking among the living. I sat back in the deep leather chair and let the profound, heavy weight of my new reality sink deep into my tired bones. The structural transformation was completely flawless. The grieving, vulnerable old man my family thought they were quietly and successfully murdering no longer existed. I had completely stripped myself of the very resources they were killing me to acquire. Their hidden poison was now entirely pointless. Their forged legal documents were completely useless paper. They were actively risking multiple life sentences in a federal penitentiary for a massive treasure chest that I had already emptied, locked, and buried at the bottom of the ocean. I thanked Sarah for her brilliant, absolutely ruthless efficiency. I stood up from the chair and slowly buttoned my wool coat. I had spent the entire morning successfully building a devastating, inescapable trap. Now I simply had to return to my house, swallow my harmless decoy pills, and wait patiently for the desperate rats to spring the fatal mechanism. The counter move was flawlessly executed. The silent adjustment was locked securely into place. I pulled into the driveway just as the streetlights flickered on. The house looked exactly the same, but my relationship to it had fundamentally changed. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, taking a deep breath to physically alter my posture. I rounded my shoulders. I let my jaw slacken slightly. I allowed a slight, imperceptible tremor to enter my hands. I was no longer the architect of their destruction. I was the collapsing structure. I unlocked the front door and shuffled inside, making sure my footsteps dragged heavily across the hardwood floor. Stephanie and Bradley were sitting in the living room watching television. They turned their heads as I entered. I did not greet them immediately. I stared blankly at the coat rack for 5 full seconds before clumsily hanging my jacket on the brass hook. I heard the television mute. The silence in the house was heavy with their sudden predatory attention. I walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. I knew Bradley had followed me. I could hear his leather shoes squeaking softly against the floorboards. I opened the cabinet and reached for a heavy glass tumbler. I closed my fingers around the smooth cylinder, but as I pulled it back, I intentionally relaxed my grip. The heavy glass slipped through my fingers and shattered violently against the granite counter. Shards of glass exploded across the floor, tinkling sharply against the tile. I let out a loud, pathetic gasp and instinctively grabbed my chest, feigning a sudden spike of panic. Bradley rushed into the kitchen. He did not ask if I was cut. He did not ask if I was hurt. He looked at the shattered glass, and a microscopic smile twitched at the corner of his mouth. He thought the digitalis was finally attacking my nervous system. He quickly masked his satisfaction with a loud, exaggerated sigh. He told me to step away before I hurt myself. He grabbed a broom and began sweeping up the mess, muttering under his breath about how clumsy I was becoming. I stood against the refrigerator, apologizing profusely, my voice trembling with manufactured shame. Stephanie walked into the kitchen, drawn by the noise. She asked what had happened. I looked at her with wide, unfocused eyes. I opened my mouth to speak, but I intentionally let the words die in my throat. I looked around the room, pretending to be deeply disoriented. I asked her where Patricia was. The question hung in the air, heavy and deeply unsettling. I asked why my wife was not in the kitchen preparing dinner. Stephanie stopped dead in her tracks. She exchanged a quick, electrified glance with Bradley. The sheer excitement radiating from them was palpable. They completely believed the toxic compound was eroding my cognitive functions, erasing my short-term memory entirely. Stephanie stepped forward and placed a hand gently on my arm. Her voice was dripping with thick, artificial sympathy. She reminded me that her mother had passed away 2 weeks ago. She spoke to me slowly, articulating every single syllable as if I were a confused toddler. I let my face collapse into an expression of profound, fresh grief. I brought my trembling hands to my face and wept. I forced the tears out, crying not for the loss of my wife, but for the absolute monstrosity of the two people standing in front of me. Bradley placed a firm hand on my back and guided me out of the kitchen. He led me to the sofa and told me to rest. He promised they would handle everything. He promised they would take care of all the difficult decisions moving forward. I lay down on the soft cushions and closed my eyes. The performance was physically exhausting, but the strategic value was immeasurable. I listened to them whispering excitedly in the kitchen. They were celebrating my rapid decline. They thought they had finally broken my mind and conquered my body. They believed the endgame was merely days away. They had no idea that every single dropped glass, every single forgotten name, and every single manufactured tear was a carefully placed brick in the wall of their own prison. I lay perfectly still in the dark, my heart beating with strong, steady rhythm. The decoy pills were safe in my system. The offshore trust was entirely secure. The Delaware Shell Company held the deed to the house. The stage was perfectly set. The psychological warfare was working exactly as I had calculated. I just needed to let their arrogance grow until it completely consumed their caution. They thought they were watching a frail old man fade away into the shadows. They did not realize I was simply waiting in the dark, completely prepared for the morning sun to expose their unforgivable crimes. The morning sun pierced through the kitchen blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. It had been exactly 3 days since I secretly transferred my entire life savings to the offshore trust and legally signed my house over to the Delaware Shell Company. I sat at the kitchen island, wearing a thick wool sweater, letting my hands tremble slightly as I held the morning newspaper. I did not read the words on the page. I was entirely focused on the sound of Bradley pacing in the main hallway. The immense pressure from his ruthless hard money lenders and the looming federal fraud indictment was visibly tearing him apart. The confident, arrogant son-in-law who had strutted through my house just a few days ago was entirely gone. In his place was a cornered, deeply desperate animal. His expensive, tailored suit was severely wrinkled. Dark, heavy bags hung under his bloodshot eyes. He was constantly checking his cellular phone, jumping violently at every single vibration, desperately waiting for the massive bank transfer that would absolutely never arrive. He had no idea the financial vault was completely empty. He only knew he was rapidly running out of time. Stephanie was upstairs, taking a long shower, leaving Bradley and me completely alone on the ground floor. I let out a loud, pathetic cough, making sure to sound incredibly weak and thoroughly disoriented. Bradley stopped pacing immediately and walked into the kitchen. He looked at me with a potent mixture of profound disgust and frantic impatience. My cognitive decline performance was working flawlessly, but it was simply not killing me fast enough to solve his immediate financial crisis. He needed the $2.5 million today. He needed my heart to stop beating right now. He walked over to the coffee machine resting on the granite counter. His movements were jerky, erratic, and highly uncoordinated. He forced a tight, artificial smile and offered to pour me a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes cast downward, playing the role of the helpless, grieving burden perfectly. I turned my body slightly on the tall wooden bar stool, angling my shoulders toward the living room. However, my eyes were locked completely on the large, dark bay window located directly opposite the kitchen counter. The morning light hitting the exterior glass turned the window into a massive, flawless mirror. I had designed this specific kitchen remodel myself over 10 years ago. As a structural engineer, I knew every exact angle, every reflection, and every blind spot in the room. From my seated position, I had a perfect, entirely unobstructed view of Bradley's back and his hands as he stood at the counter. I watched him pour the steaming black coffee into my favorite ceramic mug. He set the heavy glass pot down on the warming plate. Then his hands stopped moving completely. He stood perfectly still for 5 agonizing seconds. He glanced quickly over his shoulder to ensure I was not watching him. I kept my head down, staring blankly at the sports section of the newspaper, controlling my breathing to simulate total ignorance. Satisfied that my mind was completely gone, Bradley reached deep into the front pocket of his wrinkled suit trousers. In the clear, sharp reflection of the bay window, I saw him pull out a small, transparent glass vial. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. This was not the tampered blood pressure medication Stephanie carefully prepared every Sunday. This was the raw, unadulterated synthetic digitalis. He was bypassing the slow, methodical method of gradual poisoning entirely. His federal deadlines had forced his hand. He unscrewed the black plastic cap with visibly trembling fingers. He hovered the glass vial directly over my steaming coffee mug. The sheer terror of the moment was paralyzing, but my lifelong engineering training kept my mind perfectly anchored. I watched the physical mechanics of my own attempted murder unfold in high definition. Bradley tapped the side of the glass vial heavily with his index finger. A thick stream of pure white crystalline powder cascaded down into the dark liquid. It was not a microscopic daily dose. It was a massive, lethal dump. He emptied more than half the vial into a single cup of coffee. He was no longer trying to mimic a slow, natural decline. He was intentionally triggering a massive, immediate, and catastrophic cardiovascular failure. He wanted me dead before Stephanie even finished her shower. I remembered the harsh clinical words of Dr. Meyer in the locked office. He had warned me that a massive dose of this specific synthetic compound would cause violent, immediate tearing of the heart muscle. It would not be a peaceful fading away in my sleep. It would be an agonizing, suffocating explosion inside my chest. Bradley did not care about my pain. He did not care about the optics of a sudden, brutal death anymore. The federal walls were crushing him, and my life was the absolute last release valve he had left. He quickly screwed the cap back on and shoved the glass vial deep into his pocket. He grabbed a heavy silver spoon from the drawer and began stirring the coffee rapidly. I watched the lethal white powder dissolve completely into the black liquid, disappearing without a single trace. The poison was entirely tasteless and completely odorless. If I were truly the oblivious, grieving widower they thought I was, I would take one single sip and be dead before the ambulance could even pull into my driveway. He tapped the spoon heavily against the rim of the mug, the sharp clinking sound echoing through the quiet kitchen like a funeral bell. I had completely underestimated the sheer velocity of his panic. I knew he was desperate, but I had not anticipated a manual daylight execution in my own kitchen while my daughter was just upstairs. The silent adjustment required extreme patience, but Bradley had violently changed the rules of engagement. I took a deep, silent breath, preparing my body for the physical toll of what I absolutely had to do next. I could not refuse the coffee entirely. If I suddenly became suspicious or adamantly refused to drink, his panic would instantly transform into physical violence. He was a cornered predator, and he was fully prepared to kill me with his bare hands if the chemical poison failed. I had to neutralize the immediate threat without breaking my character for a single second. Bradley turned around, pasting that terrifying, completely artificial smile back across his exhausted face. He walked toward me holding the ceramic mug tightly by the handle. Thick steam rose from the surface, carrying the invisible promise of a lethal heart attack. He set the mug down on the granite island, directly in front of me. He placed his hand heavily on my shoulder, his grip entirely too tight, and told me to drink up while it was hot. He said the warm coffee would clear my mind and give me strength for the long day ahead. He stood right next to my stool, looking down at me, absolutely refusing to leave the room until he watched me swallow the poison. I looked at the dark liquid. I looked up at the desperate, murderous man standing right beside me. I reached out with a trembling, frail hand and wrapped my fingers slowly around the warm ceramic mug. I was inches away from sudden death, and I had exactly 3 seconds to engineer an exit strategy. My fingers gripped the smooth ceramic handle of the mug. The heat radiated through the clay, warning me of the boiling temperature. Bradley stood over me, his shadow falling directly across the granite island. He was waiting for me to raise the cup to my lips. He was waiting to watch me die. I knew I could not simply push the cup away. If I hesitated or refused, his desperation would instantly escalate into physical force. He was heavier, younger, and fueled by the absolute terror of a federal indictment. I had to destroy the poison right in front of him, without raising a single suspicion. I looked at my own hand resting on the counter. As a structural engineer, I had spent a lifetime calculating the exact cost of controlled demolitions. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a secondary beam to safely bring down the entire building. I made the calculation in a fraction of a second. The price of my immediate survival was severe physical pain. I brought the mug slightly toward my chest, simulating the clumsy motion of a frail man preparing to take a sip. Then I intentionally let my wrist buckle. I violently jerked my elbow inward, hooking the heavy ceramic mug with my forearm. The mug tipped over instantly. The dark, boiling liquid surged over the rim like a ruptured dam. I did not pull my hand back. I forced my palm and fingers to stay completely flat against the granite countertop. The scalding coffee splashed directly over my exposed skin. The pain was absolute and instantaneous. It felt as though a sheet of liquid fire had been securely wrapped around my hand. The boiling coffee seared through the top layers of my epidermis in a matter of milliseconds. My nerves screamed, sending violent shockwaves of pure agony directly into my chest. A loud, entirely genuine cry escaped my lips. I pulled my hand back instinctively, clutching it tightly to my stomach. The skin was already turning a violent, angry red. My eyes watered, instantly blurring my vision. The physical suffering was overwhelming, but underneath the blinding pain, my mind remained perfectly cold and structurally sound. The poison was completely neutralized, soaking harmlessly into the daily newspaper and dripping onto the hardwood floor. Bradley did not flinch. He did not rush forward to examine my severe burn. He did not ask if I needed ice or a doctor. Instead, he let out a loud, explosive shout of pure, unfiltered rage. The polished facade of the caring son-in-law completely shattered, revealing the cornered, desperate criminal underneath. He slammed his fists down hard on the kitchen island, dangerously close to the spreading pool of toxic coffee. He screamed at me, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. He called me a clumsy, useless old fool. He demanded to know what was wrong with my brain. He was not furious because I had severely injured myself. He was absolutely furious because I had accidentally spilled his carefully measured murder weapon. His perfect immediate solution to his massive federal debt was currently dripping off the edge of the counter. I huddled over my injured hand, rocking back and forth on the wooden stool. I let the genuine tears of physical pain stream freely down my face, weaponizing my own suffering to complete the illusion. I apologized frantically, stammering my words to sound thoroughly intimidated and profoundly confused. I told him my hands were simply shaking too much. I told him I could not feel my fingers properly anymore. I begged him not to be angry with me. Every single pathetic apology I forced through my gritted teeth acted as a heavy iron bar, reinforcing the cage I was building around him. Bradley stood over me, his chest heaving with heavy, angry breaths. He stared at the ruined coffee and then glared down at me with absolute contempt. He finally grabbed a roll of paper towels and aggressively threw them onto the spilled liquid, absorbing the lethal digitalis before it could stain the granite. He ordered me to go to the bathroom and run my hand under cold water. He turned his back on me, muttering bitter curses under his breath as he began scrubbing the counter. I stood up slowly, cradling my burned hand against my chest. The skin was blistering rapidly, and the throbbing pain was intense. But as I walked away from the kitchen, I felt a deep, profound sense of victory. The tactical sacrifice was a complete success. I had survived his desperate ambush, and his arrogance remained completely intact. 30 minutes after the coffee spilled on the granite counter, Stephanie finally came downstairs. She saw the wet paper towels and my bandaged hand. She did not ask if I was in pain. She simply glared at me and complained about the lingering smell of burnt coffee. Bradley was pacing near the front door, furiously typing on his cellular phone. He looked up and told Stephanie they needed to leave the house immediately. He claimed he had an emergency meeting with a local tax official regarding my estate planning. I knew exactly what that meant. They were out of time and completely out of patience. They were going to secure a corrupt notary, someone willing to validate a forged signature on a fraudulent power of attorney document. They needed absolute legal control over my assets before the end of the day. Stephanie grabbed her designer purse, gave me a hollow warning to stay out of trouble, and followed her husband out the door. I listened to the heavy wooden door slam shut. I waited until I heard the engine of their imported car start and the tires roll down the driveway. The moment the sound faded down the street, my trembling stopped completely. I stood up from the wooden stool. The severe burn on my right hand throbbed with the intense rhythmic heat, but I pushed the pain entirely out of my mind. I had a narrow window of absolute privacy, and I needed to gather the final physical proof of their crimes. I walked purposefully up the main staircase, my footsteps silent and steady on the carpet. I headed straight for the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. Bradley and Stephanie had commandeered the room weeks ago, turning it into their private sanctuary and Bradley's temporary home office. I grasped the brass doorknob and turned it. It was locked. I was not surprised. A man hiding a massive federal fraud scheme and a lethal supply of synthetic poison does not leave his doors open. But Bradley was a foolish, arrogant man who understood absolutely nothing about the physical world. He trusted a cheap interior residential lock to protect his darkest secrets. I walked down the hall to my personal utility closet and retrieved a small leather tool pouch. I am a structural engineer. I have spent decades studying how interlocking mechanical parts function under stress. A basic tumbler lock is nothing more than a simple puzzle of springs and metal pins. I returned to the guest bedroom door. I selected a thin steel tension wrench and a standard hook pick from my pouch. I ignored the stinging pain in my burned hand and inserted the tools into the keyhole. I applied gentle, precise pressure to the cylinder. I visualized the 5 small brass pins inside the mechanism. I lifted the first pin until I felt it click into place, then the second, then the third. The mechanical feedback traveled directly up the steel pick and into my fingers. Bradley relied on deception and lies to manipulate the world, but metal and springs do not lie. They operate on absolute mathematical rules. I lifted the final pin and turned the tension wrench. The lock gave way with a satisfying heavy click. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room smelled strongly of Stephanie's expensive perfume and Bradley's stale stress sweat. The bed was unmade. A massive, sleek laptop sat closed on a small writing desk in the corner. I ignored the computer. Sarah Jenkins had already completely dismantled his digital life. I was looking for the physical anchor of his crimes. I scanned the room with methodical precision. I looked under the bed. I checked the top shelves of the closet. Finally, I noticed a heavy black leather briefcase tucked far back into the bottom corner of the wardrobe, partially hidden behind a pile of expensive dry cleaning. I pulled the briefcase out and set it flat on the mattress. It was secured by two brass combination dials. I did not panic. Criminals who are drowning in debt and terrified of federal prison are rarely creative. They rely on the familiar to anchor themselves. I thought about the financial files Sarah had shown me. I thought about the exact date Bradley's fraudulent real estate company had officially filed for its first massive, disastrous loan. It was the absolute turning point of his life, the exact moment his massive lie began. I rolled the small brass wheels to match the month and year of that catastrophic loan. 4 numbers. I pressed the 2 release buttons on the side of the briefcase. The brass latches sprang open with a loud metallic snap. I lifted the leather lid. The interior of the case was a perfectly organized monument to his profound guilt. Lying neatly in the top compartment were 3 transparent glass vials. They were identical to the one he had pulled from his pocket in the kitchen earlier that morning. They were filled with the fine white crystalline powder, the synthetic digitalis derivative, the exact weapon he had used to slowly stop my wife's heart. I stared at the vials, feeling a cold wave of pure, concentrated hatred wash over me. But I did not touch them. I could not risk leaving a single fingerprint on the glass. Directly underneath the vials lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. I used the very tip of my pen to flip the cover open. This was not a digital file that could be easily deleted or hidden behind complex firewalls. This was Bradley's physical handwritten record of his entire criminal enterprise. The pages were completely filled with frantic, aggressive handwriting. I saw the names of his cheated investors. I saw the exact extortionate interest rates charged by the ruthless hard money lenders. I saw the desperate illegal transfers of funds between dummy corporations. And on the very last page, written in bright red ink, I saw my own name. Next to my name was the exact estimated value of my estate, $2.5 million. Beneath it, Bradley had written a timeline. It was a schedule of my planned execution directly corresponding to his impending federal deadlines. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cellular phone. I activated the camera and turned off the flash. I held the phone perfectly steady above the briefcase. I took a high-resolution photograph of the 3 glass vials of poison, ensuring the surrounding leather of his specific briefcase was clearly visible in the frame. I used my pen to slowly turn the pages of the ledger, photographing every single damning column of numbers, every single list of defrauded investors, and every single desperate calculation involving my death. I took over 40 clear, undeniable photographs. I captured the absolute essence of his betrayal in high-definition digital ink. I immediately opened my encrypted messaging application. I attached the entire folder of photographs and sent them directly to Sarah Jenkins and Dr. Meyer. The digital files flew through the air permanently, securing his destruction on secure servers located miles away. Even if Bradley burned this house to the ground today, the evidence of his crimes would survive. I carefully closed the leather-bound ledger. I arranged the glass vials exactly as I had found them. I lowered the lid of the briefcase and pressed the brass latches down until they locked securely. I scrambled the numbers on the combination dials, erasing my presence completely. I placed the briefcase back into the dark corner of the closet and covered it with the dry cleaning. I stepped out of the guest bedroom, pulled the door shut, and used my lockpicks to re-engage the deadbolt. I walked back downstairs and took my seat at the kitchen island. I wrapped my burned hand gently in a fresh towel and stared out the large bay window. I had the poison. I had the financial ledger. I had the corrupt timeline. The investigation phase of my silent adjustment was officially complete. I was now fully armed and absolutely prepared for the final confrontation. I simply had to wait for my murderous daughter and her desperate husband to return home and spring the trap themselves. The sound of their car pulling into the driveway broke the heavy silence of the late afternoon. The engine idled for a moment before shutting off entirely. I remained seated at the kitchen island, gently cradling my bandaged hand against my chest. I heard the front door open, followed immediately by the distinct sound of hushed, frantic whispering in the foyer. They were synchronizing their stories and rehearsing their lines one last time before stepping onto the stage. I let my jaw slacken slightly, rounded my shoulders to appear smaller, and fixed my gaze blankly on the grain of the wooden table. Stephanie walked into the kitchen first. She was carrying 2 large brown paper grocery bags. Her face was flushed, and she wore a bright, incredibly forced smile. The brittle edge of panic I had seen in her earlier was completely gone, replaced by a terrifying cold confidence. They had successfully secured their corrupt notary. Their escape route was finalized. She set the heavy bags on the granite counter, carefully avoiding the exact area where Bradley had frantically scrubbed away the poisoned coffee just hours before. She began pulling out expensive ingredients, one by one. I saw thick cuts of prime rib fresh organic asparagus artisan bread and 2 bottles of incredibly expensive dark red wine. She turned to me, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She offered a brief, entirely hollow apology for my burned hand, barely glancing at the thick white bandages. I waved my uninjured hand dismissively, playing the role of the tired, forgiving father perfectly. Then she clapped her hands together, creating a sharp, echoing sound in the quiet kitchen. She announced that she was preparing a very special family dinner for the following evening. She claimed we needed to sit down together as a family, celebrate my recovery from the morning accident, and properly honor Patricia's memory. The sheer, unadulterated evil of using my murdered wife's memory as the backdrop for my own assassination was physically repulsive. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced a weak, appreciative nod. Bradley stepped into the kitchen, standing right behind his wife. He had changed out of his wrinkled business suit and was wearing a casual dark cashmere sweater. He was trying desperately to project an aura of total relaxation, but the tight, strained muscles in his jaw betrayed his profound anxiety. He leaned against the counter and took over the conversation. He casually mentioned that a close business associate of his was going to stop by the house right before we sat down to eat. He quickly added that this specific associate just happened to be a licensed state notary public. Stephanie immediately chimed in, picking up the practiced routine flawlessly. She adopted a tone of mild administrative annoyance. She explained that the local tax office required a few routine signatures on some complicated municipal documents regarding Patricia's final hospital bills. She waved her hand dismissively, calling it standard bureaucratic nonsense that simply needed to be finalized quickly to avoid unnecessary late fees. She smiled at me, leaning forward so I could smell her expensive perfume. She said she specifically arranged for the notary to come directly to the house so I would not have to endure the terrible stress of driving to a busy downtown office in my fragile condition. She framed the complete theft of my life savings as an act of profound, selfless, daughterly love. I looked from Stephanie's smiling face to Bradley's intensely focused eyes. The trap they were laying was incredibly obvious, yet they fully believed they were executing a flawless masterpiece of criminal deception. I mapped out their exact battle plan in my mind. Tomorrow night they would sit me down at the head of the dining table. They would place the forged, fraudulent power of attorney documents directly in front of me, burying the critical pages under a thick stack of meaningless medical bills and tax forms. They would gently guide my trembling hand to the signature line. The corrupt notary would stamp the paper, making their absolute control over my estate entirely legal in the eyes of the state. And then, the moment the dark ink dried on the page, Bradley would uncork one of those expensive bottles of red wine. He would pour me a heavy glass thoroughly laced with the remaining synthetic digitalis he kept hidden in his leather briefcase upstairs. They would raise their glasses toast to my continued health and watch me eagerly swallow a massive, fatal dose of poison. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I let a wide, entirely grateful smile spread across my aging face. I looked at my daughter and told her she was a true blessing to me in my darkest hour. I turned to Bradley and thanked him profusely for going out of his way to handle these complicated financial matters while I was drowning in grief. I promised them both that I would be completely ready for dinner tomorrow night, and I would be fully prepared to sign whatever legal documents they needed to secure the family estate. The physical relief that washed over their faces was instantaneous and absolutely sickening. Bradley finally uncrossed his arms and let out a long, heavy breath, releasing the immense pressure of his looming federal indictments. He thought his massive debt was finally cured. He thought he had outsmarted the government, his aggressive creditors, and his own grieving father-in-law. Stephanie stepped forward and kissed me gently on the cheek. Her lips were cold. She told me to get a good night of sleep because tomorrow was going to be a highly important day for our family. I watched them leave the kitchen together, whispering excitedly as they walked up the stairs to their guest room. The house fell completely silent once again. I turned my head and looked at my own reflection in the dark glass of the bay window. The final timeline was officially locked into place. They had set the stage, they had chosen the murder weapon, and they had personally invited the audience. They firmly believed they were writing the final tragic chapter of my life. They had absolutely no idea that I had already rewritten the entire ending. The trap was set, but they were the ones standing directly on the perfectly engineered trapdoor. Tomorrow evening, the silent adjustment would become a devastating, inescapable reality. I walked down the main staircase precisely at 6 o'clock in the evening. The physical pain in my bandaged right hand was a constant dull throb, but I welcomed the sensation. The intense pain kept my mind incredibly sharp and entirely focused on the present moment. The ground floor of my home had been completely transformed. The subtle, rich smell of roasted prime rib and fresh rosemary drifted from the kitchen, deliberately masking the foul scent of the betrayal that permeated every single corner of the house. I stepped slowly into the formal dining room. It looked exactly like a stage meticulously set for a grand final tragedy. The antique mahogany table, the one Patricia and I had proudly purchased on our 5th wedding anniversary, was polished to a flawless mirror shine. The heavy silver flatware was perfectly aligned next to the bone china plates. The overhead crystal chandelier cast a warm, inviting glow over the room. It was an absolutely flawless presentation of domestic warmth, designed entirely to lower my defenses before the final fatal strike. Sitting at the far end of the long table was a man I had never seen before in my life. He wore a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit and a highly unconvincing, greasy smile. He had thin, carefully combed hair and eyes that constantly darted around the room, taking a rapid, calculating inventory of my valuable possessions. Stephanie rushed forward, the absolute second I entered the room. She linked her arm through my left arm, providing an entirely unnecessary physical support. She guided me toward the stranger with exaggerated theatrical care. Her voice was bright and melodic as she introduced him as Mr. Caldwell. She explained that he was a highly respected local notary public and a very dear trusted friend of Bradley. Mr. Caldwell stood up quickly from his chair. He did not extend his hand for me to shake. He simply gave a short, stiff bow. He opened a thick leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a massive stack of complex legal documents. He placed them directly next to the plate at the head of the table, exactly where I always sat. I looked at the thick stack of paper. I knew exactly what was buried inside. Hidden carefully beneath the routine medical releases and municipal tax forms was the fraudulent, entirely forged power of attorney. It was the absolute legal key to my $2.5 million estate. I let my knees buckle slightly as Stephanie eased me into the heavy wooden chair at the head of the table. I kept my eyes wide and entirely unfocused. I thanked Mr. Caldwell for coming to the house on such incredibly short notice. I made my voice sound deeply weak and thoroughly exhausted. I told him the intense grief was making it very difficult for me to handle my own financial affairs. Mr. Caldwell smiled that practiced predatory smile again. He told me not to worry about a single thing. He claimed his only job was to make this difficult administrative transition as seamless as possible for my grieving family. He tapped the thick stack of documents with his heavy brass pen, stating that we would enjoy our wonderful dinner first and take care of the boring bureaucratic signatures immediately afterward. It was a perfectly orchestrated, coordinated lie. They needed me relaxed. They needed me completely compliant. Most importantly, they needed me to drink the wine. The heavy swinging door to the kitchen pushed open. Bradley walked into the dining room. He was carrying a large silver tray holding 2 open bottles of incredibly expensive dark red wine and 4 large crystal goblets. He had completely abandoned the frantic, terrified demeanor he displayed in the kitchen earlier that morning. He was currently wearing the smug, victorious expression of a man who firmly believed he had completely outsmarted the entire world. He set the heavy silver tray on the wooden side buffet table. He picked up the first bottle and poured 3 normal glasses of wine. He handed one to his wife and one to the corrupt notary. Then he turned his back to the room for exactly 3 seconds. He picked up the second bottle of wine. It was the exact same expensive vintage, the exact same dark ruby color, but I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty what he had done. He had carefully dissolved the massive remaining dose of synthetic digitalis from his hidden glass vials directly into that specific bottle. Bradley walked slowly toward the head of the table. He held the 4th crystal goblet tightly in his right hand. The dark red liquid caught the bright light of the chandelier, completely masking the deadly white powder swirling within. He reached down and placed the poisoned glass precisely in the center of my woven placemat, directly next to the stack of fraudulent legal documents. The symbolism of his action was incredibly profound and entirely sickening. He was offering me a fatal dose of poison with his right hand, while aggressively demanding the complete surrender of my life savings with his left. He placed his hand heavily on my shoulder and squeezed the bone tightly. He leaned down, placing his face uncomfortably close to my ear. He told me I needed a very strong drink to steady my fragile nerves. He said the wine would help me sleep peacefully tonight. He was literally wishing me a peaceful death directly to my face, entirely confident in his impending victory. I looked down at the dark red wine. The surface of the liquid was perfectly still. I looked around the elegant table. Stephanie had deliberately taken Patricia's usual seat at the opposite end of the table, claiming her role as the new matriarch of the estate. She was watching me with absolute predatory anticipation. Mr. Caldwell was organizing his official notary stamps, completely complicit in my execution for whatever small fee they had promised him. Bradley remained standing right beside me, looming over my chair like a dark, expectant shadow. They were all waiting for me to raise the glass to my lips. They were entirely convinced that this was the final tragic scene of my life. They firmly believed that in less than an hour my heart would violently give out, the forged documents would be legally stamped, and they would walk away to pay off their massive federal debts with my $2 million. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting inside a completely empty vault. They had no idea the offshore trust was already sealed and untouchable. They had no idea the Delaware Shell Company already legally owned the very floorboards beneath their feet. I sat at the head of the table, surrounded entirely by the ruthless monsters who had murdered my wife, and I felt absolutely no fear. The stage was perfectly set. The final trap was officially sprung. The crystal goblet sat perfectly still on the woven placemat. The dark ruby liquid caught the light from the chandelier overhead. I stared at the surface of the wine, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of 3 pairs of eyes burning into my skin. Bradley stood just behind my right shoulder, his breathing shallow and rapid. He nudged the base of the glass slightly closer to my plate with his index finger. He whispered softly, urging me to take a long sip before we began the tedious paperwork. At the opposite end of the long mahogany table, my daughter Stephanie leaned forward in her chair. Her eyes were completely devoid of any human empathy. She looked like a predator waiting for a wounded animal to finally stop breathing. Mr. Caldwell sat quietly to my left, his fingers tapping impatiently against the thick stack of forged documents. The room was absolutely silent. The air was thick with their murderous anticipation. They firmly believed they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought my profound grief had completely paralyzed my survival instincts. I did not reach for the glass immediately. Instead, I placed both of my hands flat against the polished wooden table. I pushed my chair back slowly. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, shattering the quiet tension in the room. I forced my legs to tremble as I stood up, maintaining the illusion of a weak, broken man for just a few more seconds. I reached out with my right hand, the one wrapped in thick white bandages from the morning coffee incident. I let my fingers hover over the rim of the poisoned goblet. Bradley let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh of profound relief. He thought I was preparing to make a final tragic toast to my deceased wife. I wrapped my bandaged fingers around the smooth crystal stem. I lifted the heavy glass a few inches off the table. I looked directly down the length of the table into Stephanie's cold, expectant eyes. I told her I wanted to dedicate this drink to the absolute truth. Then I moved with a sudden, violent speed that entirely defied my age. I did not bring the glass to my lips. I swung my arm sharply to the right in a wide, vicious arc. I released my grip completely. The heavy crystal goblet flew across the table and crashed directly into Stephanie's chest. The glass shattered violently against the edge of her plate. The dark red wine exploded outward in a massive wave. The poisoned liquid soaked instantly into the fabric of her expensive silk dress, staining it the color of fresh blood. Stephanie let out a piercing, terrified scream. She jumped back from the table, knocking her heavy wooden chair crashing to the floor. She clawed frantically at her ruined clothing, her perfectly constructed facade of polite concern completely destroyed by the sudden chaos. Bradley lunged forward, cursing loudly, his hands reaching out instinctively to grab my shoulders. He never made contact. I turned and slapped his hands away with a force that sent him stumbling backward into the side buffet table. The frail, confused old man vanished completely in that exact fraction of a second. I straightened my spine, standing up to my full height of 6 feet and 2 inches. The manufactured tremor in my hands stopped entirely. The engineered confusion completely evaporated from my eyes. I looked at Bradley, who was staring at me in absolute paralyzed shock. He rubbed his wrists completely, unable to process the sudden massive physical strength I had just displayed. Mr. Caldwell froze in his seat, his hand hovering uselessly over the stack of forged documents. The entire dynamic of the room shifted with the force of a massive earthquake. They were no longer the hunters confidently cornering a wounded deer. They were suddenly trapped in a locked room with a fully awakened predator. I looked down at Stephanie. She was still gasping for air, staring in horror at the dark wine dripping from her clothes onto the expensive hardwood floor. I did not offer her a towel. I did not offer a single word of apology. I spoke, and my voice was completely unrecognizable to them. It was not the soft, grieving whisper of a defeated father. It was the cold, resonant, and absolute command of a master structural engineer who had just assumed total control of a collapsing building. I told her to sit down and shut her mouth. The sheer authority in my tone hit her like a physical blow. Her screaming stopped instantly. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. I told them the theatrical performance was officially over. I instructed Mr. Caldwell to put his pen down and keep his hands perfectly visible on the table if he wanted to leave this house without handcuffs. I turned my attention back to Bradley, who was currently trembling against the buffet table. I told him his desperate, pathetic murder attempt was a complete failure. The heavy, suffocating silence of absolute terror filled the dining room. They finally understood that I knew exactly what was inside that glass. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my wool coat. My movements were no longer frail or hesitant. They were sharp, deliberate, and completely controlled. I pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope that Sarah Jenkins had prepared for me. I tossed it onto the center of the polished mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud, sliding directly over the fraudulent medical releases and the forged power of attorney. I looked directly at Mr. Caldwell. The corrupt notary was trembling in his chair, his eyes wide with sudden panic. I advised him in a perfectly calm, icy tone to pack his bags and leave my property immediately. I told him the document he had been hired to stamp was a complete criminal forgery. I informed him that my estate lawyer had already contacted the state licensing board regarding his specific involvement in this conspiracy. Mr. Caldwell did not attempt to argue. He did not ask a single question. He scrambled out of his chair, grabbed his briefcase, and sprinted toward the front door, abandoning his desperate clients entirely. The heavy wooden door slammed shut, leaving Bradley and Stephanie completely alone with me. I opened the manila envelope and pulled out the first document. It was the newly minted warranty deed to the property. I slid the heavy watermarked paper across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of Bradley. I commanded him to read the name of the legal owner. Bradley stared at me, his chest heaving with panicked breaths, before dropping his gaze to the document. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched his jaw drop. I explained the reality of his situation with surgical precision. I told him I no longer owned the house we were standing in. I explained that exactly 3 days ago I had legally sold the entire estate to an anonymous corporate entity registered in the state of Delaware. I told him about the irrevocable lifetime residency clause that protected me, but left the property completely useless to him. I made sure he understood the absolute finality of the legal maneuver. I told him he could not sell the house. He could not take out a mortgage against it. He absolutely could not use it as collateral to appease his ruthless hard money lenders. The massive family home he had planned to leverage was now a complete financial phantom. Stephanie began to weep loudly from the other end of the table, but I ignored her entirely. I reached back into the envelope and pulled out the second set of documents. These were the certified banking statements from my primary accounts. I slid them directly over the warranty deed. I told Bradley to look at the final balances. I watched the remaining color drain completely from his face as he stared at the rows of zeros. He looked like a man who had just stepped off the edge of a massive cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. I told him that every single liquid asset, every penny of my pension, and the entire life insurance payout from Patricia had been permanently transferred. I told him the money now resided in an impenetrable, irrevocable offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. I leaned forward, resting my knuckles firmly on the table. I told him I knew exactly what had happened at his local bank branch earlier this afternoon. I told him I knew his desperate fraudulent wire transfer for $500,000 had violently failed due to entirely insufficient funds. I told him his corporate accounts were currently frozen and completely under investigation. The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by Stephanie sobbing into her wine-stained dress. I turned my attention to my daughter. I completely dismantled her artificial life. I recited her exact debts out loud, projecting my voice so every single word echoed off the walls. I mentioned the $400,000 in secret unsecured consumer credit. I mentioned the $30,000 vacations and the $90,000 imported sports car lease. I told her she was a complete financial fraud, living a pathetic, empty life built entirely on lies and stolen money. I told her she was drowning in her own vanity. Then I turned my absolute focus back to Bradley. I laid out the entire architecture of his criminal enterprise. I spoke the exact name of his fraudulent luxury condominium project. I stated the exact amount he owed to his private equity lenders, $1.8 million. I told him I knew the Securities and Exchange Commission was currently preparing to unseal a massive federal indictment against him for wire fraud and embezzlement. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated terror. He realized I possessed total, absolute knowledge of his darkest secrets. But I was not finished. I needed to shatter his mind completely. I told Bradley that while he was busy securing a corrupt notary this afternoon, I was busy picking the lock on the guest bedroom door. I told him I had opened his black leather briefcase hidden behind the dry cleaning in the closet. I told him I had found the 3 transparent glass vials filled with synthetic digitalis. I told him I had read every single page of his handwritten financial ledger. I told him I had taken high-resolution photographs of his entire murder plot and securely transmitted them to my lawyer and to the head of cardiology at the local hospital. Bradley stumbled backward against the buffet table, his legs completely giving out. He slid down the wooden cabinet and collapsed onto the floor. He was entirely broken. I raised my voice, delivering the final devastating blow. I told them they had systematically poisoned my beautiful wife for 3 months. They had murdered the mother of this family for $2.5 million. They had spent the last week actively trying to stop my heart with their deadly white powder. And they had done it all for absolutely nothing. The money was completely gone. The inheritance they had killed for simply did not exist anymore. They had traded their humanity, their freedom, and their very souls for an entirely empty vault. I stood tall at the head of the table, looking down at the absolute ruins of their lives. The dismantling of their arrogance was total and complete. The absolute finality of my words hung heavily in the dining room air, suffocating the last remaining breath of Bradley's manufactured reality. I watched the exact moment his mind completely snapped. The calculated, arrogant son-in-law vanished entirely, replaced by a cornered, rabid animal facing the absolute destruction of his life. He let out a raw, guttural scream that tore through his throat and echoed off the walls. He did not try to run. He did not try to deny the overwhelming evidence of his crimes. He pushed himself off the floor, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He lunged directly across the polished mahogany table. His heavy dress shoes crushed the fallen wooden chair beneath his weight. His hands reached out violently. His fingers curled into desperate claws, aiming straight for my throat. He knocked over the heavy silver wine tray. The crystal goblets shattered instantly against the hardwood floor, sending shards of glass flying across the room. The forged legal documents scattered violently into the air, fluttering down around us like dead leaves in a storm. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground at the head of the table, planting my feet firmly against the floorboards. I braced for the physical impact. I was fully prepared to fight him with my bare hands, knowing that his desperate, pathetic rage was the ultimate confirmation of my complete victory. His heavy body slammed into the edge of the table, sending the bone china plates crashing to the ground in a cacophony of breaking porcelain. He grabbed the lapels of my wool coat, his eyes wide and completely manic. He screamed that I had ruined him. He screamed that he was going to kill me right here in the ruins of my own dining room. He pulled me violently forward, his hot, sour breath hitting my face. I looked directly into his manic eyes and told him he was already a dead man walking. Before his fingers could tighten around my neck, the heavy oak front door of my house exploded inward. The violent sound of splintering wood and shattering brass hinges echoed through the entire first floor like a massive thunderclap. The sheer acoustic force of the sudden breach stopped Bradley entirely in his tracks. His grip on my coat loosened as confusion temporarily overpowered his rage. We both turned our heads toward the main hallway. Heavy synchronized footsteps thundered rapidly across the foyer floorboards. Deep, commanding voices shouted clear, absolute orders, cutting sharply through the thick tension of the dining room. A flood of dark, tactical uniforms poured into the formal dining space. 6 federal marshals wearing heavy ballistic vests swarmed the room, their weapons drawn, and leveled directly at Bradley's chest. They ordered him to drop to his knees and raise his hands immediately. Bradley completely froze. The manic rage drained instantly from his face, leaving behind nothing but the hollow, terrifying realization of his absolute doom. He slowly uncurled his fingers from my coat lapels. He took one clumsy step backward, raising his trembling hands high into the air. 2 heavily armed marshals closed the distance in a fraction of a second. They grabbed his arms, forced him violently to the ground, and pressed his face hard against the polished hardwood floor. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around his wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the mechanical sound of absolute justice locking perfectly into place. As the marshals secured Bradley firmly on the floor, Sarah Jenkins walked calmly through the shattered front entryway. She stepped gracefully over the broken wood and entered the dining room. She wore a sharp tailored black suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase. She looked less like a corporate estate lawyer and more like an angel of absolute retribution. Right beside her walked a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a beige trench coat. He was the lead homicide detective for the city police department. They walked straight up to the ruined mahogany table. The detective pulled a sealed, transparent evidence bag from his inner jacket pocket and dropped it heavily onto the polished wood right next to the spilled wine. Inside the bag was a certified stamped copy of the state laboratory toxicology report. He looked down at Bradley, who was currently pressing his bleeding cheek against the floorboards in total defeat. The detective announced in a loud, booming voice that Bradley and Stephanie were both officially under arrest for the premeditated first-degree murder of Patricia Wallace. He stated clearly that a tactical team had successfully secured a warrant and raided the guest bedroom upstairs just 5 minutes ago. They had found the locked leather briefcase hidden in the closet. They had successfully recovered the 3 glass vials of synthetic digitalis. They had seized the handwritten financial ledger. The undeniable physical evidence of their monstrous crime was now securely in police custody. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward, looking down at the broken man on the floor. She unclasped her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of federal court documents. She informed Bradley that the local homicide charges were merely the beginning of his unending nightmare. She formally announced that the Securities and Exchange Commission had officially unsealed his massive federal indictment less than an hour ago. She listed his crimes with cold, surgical precision. She stated the specific charges of massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate defrauding of vulnerable elderly investors. She told him he was facing 2 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of parole. She looked at him with absolute contempt and told him his fraudulent empire was completely eradicated from the earth. At the far end of the ruined dining room, Stephanie remained completely frozen in her chair. The dark red wine was still dripping slowly from her ruined silk dress, forming a thick puddle on the floor. 2 female police officers approached her quickly, instructing her to stand up and place her hands behind her back. The physical reality of the cold steel handcuffs finally broke her catatonic shock. She began to thrash violently, knocking her chair forcefully to the ground. She screamed at the officers, demanding they let her go immediately, claiming she was a highly respectable woman from a wealthy family. The officers ignored her entirely, securing her wrists with practiced, forceful efficiency. Stephanie turned her head desperately toward me. The cold, predatory monster vanished, replaced instantly by the pathetic, helpless child she used to be. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup and mixing with the dark wine. She cried out for me. She begged me to call my lawyers to pay her massive bail to fix this terrible misunderstanding immediately. She called me her beloved father and pleaded with me to save her life. I walked slowly down the length of the dining room, stepping carefully over the broken glass and the ruined plates. I stopped right in front of her. I looked directly into her terrified, weeping eyes. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep well of paternal love I had carried in my heart for 38 years was completely dry, burned away entirely by the lethal white powder she had fed to her mother. I kept my voice perfectly steady and incredibly quiet, ensuring she heard every single syllable over the chaos. I told her that I had no daughter. I told her the child I raised died the exact moment she decided to put poison into my wife's morning tea. I turned my back on her permanently and instructed the officers to get the murderers out of my house. The federal marshals hauled Bradley roughly to his feet. His expensive cashmere sweater was covered in thick dust and spilled wine. He was babbling incoherently, his mind completely shattered by the absolute magnitude of his defeat. They dragged him through the main hallway and out the front door. The female officers followed closely behind, pulling a sobbing, entirely hysterical Stephanie along the floor. I walked to the large front window and looked out into the cool night air. The entire street was brilliantly illuminated by the violently flashing red and blue lights of 6 separate police cruisers. My neighbors had stepped out onto their front porches, watching in stunned silence as the wealthy, arrogant couple was dragged down my front walkway in heavy steel chains. They were shoved forcefully into the back of separate squad cars. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing them inside their new permanent reality. I stood alone in the quiet ruins of my dining room, listening to the wailing police sirens fade slowly into the distance. The corrupted structure was completely demolished. The toxic foundation was completely removed. The raid was over, and the silent adjustment was finally complete. 3 months passed since the night the federal marshals shattered my front door. The bitter winter melted into a cold and unforgiving spring. I sat quietly in the back row of the massive federal courtroom. The benches were made of solid, heavy oak. The ceilings were incredibly high, designed to make every single person inside feel small and completely subject to the absolute power of the law. I wore a dark tailored suit. My burned right hand was fully healed, leaving only a thin, pale scar across my knuckles as a permanent reminder of the tactical sacrifice I had made. I looked down at the 2 defense tables separated by a wide aisle of carpet. Bradley sat at the left table. Stephanie sat at the right. They were wearing standard-issue orange prison uniforms. The expensive tailored suits and the designer silk dresses were completely gone. They had been stripped of their wealthy facade, reduced to nothing but 2 desperate inmates fighting for their miserable lives. The trial was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. The moment the steel doors of the county jail had closed behind them 3 months ago, their unified front completely disintegrated. They turned on each other with the vicious and unrestrained ferocity of starving rats trapped in a sinking cage. Bradley had a high-priced defense attorney paid for entirely by the court after his assets were officially frozen. His lawyer stood up and painted Stephanie as a cold and calculating psychopath. He argued that Stephanie had hated her mother for years. He claimed she had independently purchased the synthetic digitalis and systematically poisoned Patricia entirely on her own to secure the inheritance. He painted Bradley as a foolish and ignorant husband who only discovered the murder plot at the very last minute and tried to stop it. Stephanie and her public defender immediately fired back with equal venom. Her lawyer portrayed Bradley as a violently abusive and deeply manipulative monster. She argued that Bradley had forced Stephanie into complete submission, threatening to destroy her life if she did not help him murder her parents to save his failing real estate empire. They completely destroyed whatever remaining dignity they possessed, openly screaming accusations at each other across the quiet courtroom, while the jury watched in absolute disgust. The federal prosecutor did not even have to exert much effort. He simply let them tear each other apart for a few days before bringing down the absolute crushing weight of the physical evidence. Sarah Jenkins took the witness stand and laid out the devastating financial motive with flawless and surgical precision. She walked the jury through the massive and fraudulent Ponzi scheme Bradley had constructed. She exposed the hundreds of thousands of dollars in secret credit card debt Stephanie had accumulated. She explained exactly how I had legally moved my entire $2 million estate into an impenetrable offshore trust, proving that their murderous desperation was completely in vain. Then Dr. Meyer took the stand. He presented the certified state toxicology reports. He explained the terrifying mechanics of the synthetic digitalis. He looked directly at the jury and described exactly how agonizing the final weeks of my wife had been. Finally, the prosecutor projected the high-resolution photographs I had taken inside the locked briefcase onto a massive screen in the center of the courtroom. The jury saw the 3 glass vials of poison. They saw the handwritten financial ledger detailing my planned execution. The physical proof was entirely absolute and completely undeniable. During his closing statement, the prosecutor walked over to the evidence table. He picked up the heavy plastic bag containing the tampered blood pressure capsules. He held the bag high in the air, allowing the bright courtroom lights to catch the lethal white powder mixed with the life-saving medicine. He told the jury that this was the ultimate symbol of their absolute depravity. They had taken a father and his unconditional trust and turned it into a daily game of Russian roulette. The prosecutor pointed a finger directly at Stephanie and called her a parasite who had fed entirely on the warm blood of her parents until there was absolutely nothing left but dry bones. The jury members nodded in solemn agreement. The entire trial felt less like a legal debate and more like a highly organized public execution of their character. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned to the jury box, they did not even glance in the direction of the defense tables. The foreperson stood up and read the verdict clearly into the microphone. Guilty on all counts of first-degree premeditated murder. Guilty on all counts of attempted murder. Guilty on all federal charges of wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement. Bradley collapsed forward, burying his face in his shackled hands. Stephanie let out a loud and piercing wail that echoed terribly through the high ceilings of the courtroom. The presiding judge did not wait another day to deliver the sentencing. He adjusted his black robes, looked down from his high wooden bench, and delivered a speech that was entirely devoid of human mercy. He stated that in his 30 years on the judicial bench, he had never witnessed a more callous and grotesque display of absolute greed. He told them they had weaponized the sacred trust of a family to commit an unforgivable slaughter. He struck his wooden gavel against the sound block with a heavy and cracking sound. He sentenced Bradley to 2 consecutive life terms in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of parole. He sentenced Stephanie to the exact same fate in a state correctional facility for women. The heavy steel chains around their waists clinked loudly as the court bailiffs pulled them roughly to their feet. As they were being dragged toward the holding cells at the very back of the courtroom, Stephanie turned her head and looked back at me one final time. Her face was completely soaked in tears, and her eyes were wide with sheer terror. She was silently begging me for a single ounce of pity. I sat perfectly still in the heavy oak pew. I did not blink. I did not nod. I gave her absolutely nothing. I watched the heavy wooden door close firmly behind them, locking them permanently in the dark. The morning air was sharp and biting. I walked slowly up the gentle green hill of the cemetery, feeling the damp morning dew soak into the leather of my shoes. The sky above was a brilliant, unbroken blue. I held a single red rose tightly in my hand. The cemetery was completely empty. There were no flashing police lights. There were no screaming lawyers. There were no desperate, greedy family members begging for unearned mercy. There was only the quiet, steady rustle of the winter wind moving through the ancient oak trees. I reached the crest of the hill and stopped. I stood before the polished granite headstone bearing Patricia's name. I looked at the deep letters carved into the stone. The permanence of the monument was both devastating and profoundly comforting. I knelt slowly onto the wet grass, ignoring the cold seeping into my trousers. I placed the bright red rose directly below the engraved dates of her life. I reached out and rested my palm flat against the freezing granite. The solid stone grounded me, connecting me to the absolute reality of her absence. I took a deep breath and began to speak to my wife. I did not whisper. I used my full, clear voice, letting the words carry freely across the silent, rolling lawns. I told her that our house was finally quiet again. I told her the terrible, suffocating darkness that had invaded our home was completely eradicated. I looked at her name and told her I had kept my promise. I confessed that my initial instinct standing in that locked medical office 3 months ago had been pure, blinding violence. When I saw the lethal white powder they had used to stop her heart, I wanted to tear them apart with my bare hands. I wanted to burn everything to the ground in a fit of chaotic, uncontrollable rage. But I told Patricia I knew that such a reaction would only destroy the honorable life we had spent 40 years building together. I told her I chose to be the methodical engineer she had loved. I did not use violence. I used absolute cold precision. I calculated the exact vulnerabilities of their arrogant, greedy lives. I built an invisible cage out of legal documents, silent observations, and their own blinding entitlement. I told her I systematically removed the foundation of their world and let their own massive sins pull them down into the abyss. I spoke the names of our daughter and her husband out loud for the very absolute last time. The syllables felt like dead ash in my mouth. I told Patricia exactly where they were. I described the heavy steel doors, the concrete walls, and the double life sentences they now faced in maximum security prisons. I assured her they could never hurt another living soul ever again. They were permanently locked away, completely consumed by the massive federal debts and the monstrous lies they had so desperately tried to hide. I told her I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret for putting them in those cages. They had chosen their dark path the very moment they slipped poison into her morning tea. I simply engineered the absolute inescapable consequences of their own horrific actions. I stood back up, planting my feet firmly on the ground. The warmth of the morning sun finally broke through the thin clouds, casting a bright golden light across the gray headstone. I told Patricia that her dignity was entirely restored. Her beautiful memory was no longer stained by their grotesque greed or their pathetic, artificial smiles. I promised her that the financial empire they had murdered her to steal was completely safe. I told her I was using the untouchable offshore trust to establish a massive educational scholarship in her name. Her legacy would not fund a fraudulent real estate empire or a desperate, vain lifestyle. Her legacy would build futures for honest, hardworking people. I looked at the red rose resting against the solid stone. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle permanently into my chest. The heavy, suffocating weight of the past 3 months lifted completely from my tired shoulders. The monsters were destroyed. The silent adjustment was flawlessly executed and finalized. I told my beautiful wife that I would love her until my own final breath. I promised her I would visit every single week. I turned my back to the grave and walked slowly down the green hill, leaving the tragedy entirely behind me. I stepped confidently into the quiet, absolute freedom of the rest of my life. The drive back from the cemetery was quiet. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. For the first time in over 3 months, I looked at my 2-story brick house and felt absolutely no sense of impending dread. The property was no longer a battlefield. It was no longer a massive financial target painted on my back. It was simply my home again. The Delaware Shell Company held the official deed securely in a steel vault hundreds of miles away, but the physical walls belonged entirely to me. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The heavy, suffocating silence that had haunted these rooms since Patricia passed away was completely gone. It was replaced by a deep, profound tranquility. I walked through the main hallway, my footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floors. There were no packed cardboard boxes. There were no greedy whispers leaking from the guest bedroom. The house was clean, empty, and perfectly secure. I had successfully reinforced the foundation of my own life. I walked into my home office and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure communication portal Sarah Jenkins had set up for me. The offshore trust was fully operational, but I had absolutely no intention of letting that money sit idle in a dark foreign bank account. Wealth without purpose is exactly what poisoned my daughter. I sent a direct authorization to the trustee. We were establishing a permanent endowment. It is called the Patricia Wallace Memorial Scholarship for Structural Engineering. Every single year, a massive portion of the trust-generated interest will pay the full college tuition for 3 hardworking, low-income students. I wanted to take the exact $2 million that Bradley and Stephanie had murdered my wife to steal and use it to build strong, honest futures for young people who actually understand the value of hard work. Patricia would have loved that. She spent her entire life nurturing people, and now her legacy will continue to nurture brilliant minds for generations to come. The money they killed for is now actively working to put good into the world. I closed the laptop and walked into the kitchen. I reached into the cabinet and pulled out my favorite ceramic mug. I brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. The rich, bold aroma filled the room, completely overriding the terrible memory of the poisoned cup from months ago. I poured the steaming black liquid into my mug. I did not hesitate. I did not search the reflection in the window for hidden enemies. I simply lifted the cup to my lips and took a long, deeply satisfying sip. The warmth spread through my chest. I looked down at my right hand. The skin was completely healed. I walked through the living room, opened the front door, and stepped out onto my wide wooden porch. The morning sun was climbing higher into the bright blue sky, casting a warm golden light across the neighborhood. I sat down in my wooden rocking chair. I listened to the birds singing in the ancient oak trees. I watched a neighbor walk his dog down the quiet sidewalk. The world was moving forward, entirely untouched by the massive violent tragedy that had occurred inside my dining room. That is the true beauty of a perfectly executed structural demolition. You remove the rot, you clear the dangerous debris, and you leave the surrounding area completely safe and undisturbed. I did not let their monstrous greed turn me into a monster. I used my intellect, my patience, and my absolute resolve to correct a terrible wrong. I am 69 years old. I have no living family left, but I am not lonely. I am surrounded by the beautiful memories of my 40 years with Patricia, and I am entirely secure in the future I have built. The structural flaws have been identified and permanently removed. The silent adjustment is finally complete. Did you like my story today? Let me know which city you are listening from, and let us meet in the comments section below. If you appreciate the story, you can support me by liking and subscribing so I can keep bringing more life lessons like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to reading your comments. See you in the next life story.